Okay, now I've pulled up that extraordinary map that's based on the 1860 census that shows the distribution of slaves throughout the states of the South where slavery existed. It again, we know a lot about slavery just because slaves, they're human beings, but they're also property that can be bought and sold, which is a whole nother kind of incredibly horrible thing about slavery. Can you think about what it would be like to be both a human being and knowing that your property that you could be bought and sold? Um, how it would totally mess with your head. So what happened is the reason that we have a good sense of where slaves were and the density of slaves is that they showed up on the census because they're property, and the government was counting slaves. And one of the things I want to stress as you look at this map is the density of slavery into Texas. So the big story is, and I posted this map a couple of weeks ago, what you have is a movement of slaves from the upper South, especially Virginia, to the lower South between, say, 1810 and 1860. This is the intense cotton growing area. Not that there wasn't cotton growing here, but the further north you went, the less the land was good for cotton. So in Virginia, really the profits from slavery didn't come from growing cotton, it came from selling slaves to states that did grow cotton. And over 1 million slaves in that period between 1810 or so and 1860 were forcibly moved to the South from the upper North. There was this intense slave trade from the upper South to the lower South, and of course, Texas is part of that trade, especially after 1845 when it becomes part of the United States. So, if you look at the map, you'll see that Texas is the westernmost area where slavery existed. And as I've talked a lot, you see how the darker the color, the more intense the number of slaves, the higher density of slaves. The lighter the color, the less intensity of slaves. And as I've talked about before, one of the reasons that slavery wasn't such a major institution in San Antonio and Austin in the hill country was that there wasn't enough rain in this area to grow cotton without irrigation. You really can't grow cotton without irrigation west of Austin. There's not enough natural rain. Now, in 2020, most of the cotton that, or a large percent of the cotton that's grown is actually grown around Lubbock but that's because there's an aquifer up there that they're sucking dry in order to grow cotton. And where does most of the cotton in 2020 go? It goes to China for making fabrics, but that's 2020. Let's go back to the 1800s. So Texas is the furthest west of the slave states, and San Antonio arguably is the furthest western city. There were slaves in San Antonio, but not nearly as many slaves in San Antonio as there were in places like Houston, in the area around Houston, in East Texas. And just to remind you, about 183,000 slaves in Texas by 1860. So just to give you some more statistics, by 1860, about 25 or 30% of all white families in Texas owned at least one slave. Texas ranked 10th in total slave population and 9th in percentage of slave population. 1/3 of Texans were slaves. Of those 25 or 30% of Texas families that owned slaves, only 2% owned 20 or more slaves. Okay, so the vast majority of slaveholders owned less than 20 slaves. The large plantations were an anomaly. They were outliers. Most Texans that owned slaves owned far less than 20. Now, partially this is because of costs. And again, I'm talking about human beings, and I'm not talking about cost, and I'm not trying to be bloodless here or de-emphasize the horrors of slavery, but I just want to explain the realities of slavery to you. So in 2020 dollars, a healthy male about the age of 20 would be worth somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 in 2020 money. So slaves were expensive. They were an expensive and highly desirable property. And the price of slaves was not going down before the Civil War. It was going up. I can't really stress to you the fact that slavery was going full bore when the Civil War started. It was not an institution that was on the decline. It was an institution that was still growing. I talked about how many slaves could have come into Texas. And in preparing this lecture, I found a quote from an Austin newspaper that said that Texas could hold, the Austin, Texas State Gazette, in the 50s, it estimated that Texas could hold as many as 2 million slaves. So that's what we're looking at had the Civil War not come in and stopped the institution of slavery. So slavery in Texas basically had just gotten a foothold in Texas, and it would have expanded at least 10 times and maybe even more if it hadn't been for the Civil War. Okay, so let's go back to this figure. 25 or 30% of white families own slaves, and only 2% of white families owned more than 20 slaves because of the cost. But this does not let white people off the hook. Because one of the things that we now understand about slavery is this: if you were a white, if you're a member of a white family, let's say you're the husband, and you don't have the $70,000 in 2020 dollars to purchase a slave, what would often happen is that big slaveholders, even smaller ones, they would rent out slaves. So you could actually rent a slave for a year from an owner. This is another way that slave owners made money. They would lease slaves out. So when you say, well, when I say that 25 or 30% of white Texans own slaves, you would probably have to even double that when you think about the number of Texans that had access to slave labor via renting slaves. And again, this horrible reality that slaves were property. So the 20, I'll say 25% of Texans own slaves, only 2% own slaves, only 2% of white Texans own more than 20 slaves. But the awful reality is that you didn't have to own a slave to have access to slave labor, that you could rent out a slave for a year from a master. Okay, so slavery, it insinuated itself almost completely into Texas life, much more than the figures would even indicate. 40%, now I'm throwing a lot of facts and figures at you, and I'll let you know exactly what I'm going to test you on. As I've said many times, I understand that the reason a lot of you hate history is the facts and figures. So I'll indicate the ones that I want you to know. So don't get all frustrated as I'm throwing these figures out at you. I'll make it clear what you're going to be tested on. So about 40% or so of Texas slaves lived along in the Gulf Coast and East Texas river valleys. And they grew corn, but also you can't forget in Texas and Louisiana, I said corn. Some slaves did grow corn. That was one of the staples of Texas during this period. But of course, the money crop was cotton, as I've said a million times. But there was also another significant crop in Texas and Louisiana, sugar. Did you ever wonder where Sugarland got its name? Well, they used to grow sugar in that area. So Texas slaves were also involved in growing sugar, but by far the majority of the slaves were growing cotton, which was really the big money crop. So 50% of slaves worked either alone or in small groups, far less than 20. And it turned out that it was actually worse to be um, in a situation where there were fewer slaves than more slaves, because there was really no place to hide. If you worked in a situation where there were only a couple of slaves, the white master could really keep a very, very close eye on you and surveillance. If you worked on a bigger plantation, actually it was harder for the master to keep an eye on slaves on bigger plantations. So slavery was much tougher in those situations where you didn't have many fellow slaves owned by a white master. So let me stress again, slavery mostly in East Texas. The last thing I wanted to say is over 90% and maybe even more slaves lived in rural areas. You did have some slaves working in cities like Houston, Austin. Texas cities were not very big at this time. There wasn't a big population of Texas cities. It's definitely a rural state. So the vast, vast majority of slaves, well over 90%, maybe even 95%, lived in rural areas, did not live in the cities that were developing during this time.